Imagine a world where silence is as sharp as drawn steel. The morning mist clings to the ancient pines, heavy with the unspoken promise of violence, while a man sits motionless in the quiet dawn. He is not a monster, nor is he merely a mindless soldier. He is a scholar of death, a poet who understands that the falling cherry blossom is beautiful precisely because it is destined to die. For centuries, the world has been captivated by the myth of the samurai. We picture the lone swordsman cutting down his enemies in a blur of motion, a stoic, brooding warrior without fear or hesitation. But the Hollywood myth is a shallow reflection of a much deeper, more profound truth. The reality of the samurai is a paradox that defies simple explanation. They were men capable of terrifying brutality on the battlefield, yet they could spend hours weeping over the delicate beauty of a blooming flower. They wielded weapons designed to cleave through bone and iron armor, but their hands were equally skilled at gently brushing ink onto fine paper to compose heartbreaking poetry. What kind of mind can hold such extreme contradictions without shattering completely? To understand the samurai is to understand a society built entirely on the extremely fragile edge of a blade. It is a journey into a psychological landscape where honor was more valuable than oxygen, where failure was erased only by the ultimate agonizing sacrifice, and where a single perfect cut could define a lifetime of absolute devotion. This is not just a story of ancient war and endless bloodshed. This is the story of humanity pushed to its absolute physical and mental limits, bound by an unbreakable code, and searching for peace in a world defined almost entirely by chaos. We are going to strip away the ornate armor and look directly into the eyes of history's most fiercely dedicated warriors. We will explore the hidden rituals you have never heard of, the grueling daily realities they endured in times of unexpected peace, and the terrifying spiritual convictions that made them legendary across the globe. Listen closely to the wind, for the ghosts of the past are about to speak. To truly comprehend the world that forged the samurai, we must first transport ourselves to a land defined by extreme isolation and untamed violent nature. Feudal Japan was an ancient world completely apart from the rest of the globe. It was an expansive archipelago of volcanic islands, rising steeply and dramatically from the unpredictable depths of the Pacific Ocean. The terrain of this country was undeniably breathtaking, yet it was equally harsh and entirely unforgiving. It was a rugged landscape dominated by jagged, heavily forested mountain ranges that deliberately fractured the nation into dozens of secluded, hidden valleys and narrow, easily defended coastal plains. Nature itself seemed to conspire against peace, regularly unleashing terrifying earthquakes, devastating typhoons, and sudden volcanic eruptions that reminded the inhabitants of their profound vulnerability. Because less than 20% of this incredibly mountainous land was actually flat enough to be suitable for farming, control over every single inch of fertile soil was a literal matter of life and death. You could not simply move to the next valley if you were pushed out. The mountains formed towering, impassable walls between rival domains. This intensely isolating geography naturally bred a fiercely localized mindset among the people who worked the land. Communities grew intensely, almost obsessively loyal to their immediate region, and the powerful local warlords who promised to protect them from outsiders. The rugged terrain made communication and travel incredibly difficult, which meant that a unified central government struggled to exert any real control over the distant, wild provinces. This geographical reality set the perfect, highly combustible stage for centuries of bitter, unrelenting territorial conflict. It was exactly within this deeply fragmented, inherently dangerous landscape that the concept of a dedicated, highly trained professional warrior class became not just a useful political tool, but an absolute, undeniable necessity for mere survival. You needed men who were willing to spill blood to protect the precious rice paddies, because rice was the ultimate currency, the very foundation of life and power in early Japan. To understand how these warriors eventually took over, we have to look closely at the rigid, unyielding social hierarchy that defined Japanese society during this era. At the very top of this highly structured world sat the emperor, residing in the ancient, refined imperial capital of Kyoto. The emperor was not viewed merely as a king. He was revered as a living god, universally believed to be the direct, unbroken descendant of the great sun goddess Amaterasu. His existence was sacred, and his person was considered holy. Yet, for the vast majority of Japan's incredibly bloody history, the emperor held absolutely no practical political power. He was an incredibly potent symbol of divine authority, cloaked in layers of priceless silk, surrounded by beautiful art, and permanently hidden behind the heavily guarded walls of the imperial palace. The imperial court was a place of delicate poetry, intricate ceremonies, and complex aristocratic romance, completely, intentionally removed from the dirt, the disease, and the horrific bloodshed of the real world outside the capital. The true, undeniable power over the nation, the actual physical control of the people and the land, rested in the heavily calloused hands of the shogun. The title of shogun essentially translates to the supreme military dictator of Japan. While the emperor theoretically appointed the shogun, in reality, the shogun was the man who commanded the largest, most terrifying army, essentially ruling the country by absolute force of will and the sharp edge of the sword. Beneath the terrifying authority of the shogun were the daimyo. These were the incredibly powerful regional lords, ruthless and ambitious men who ruled over vast, independent domains like sovereign kings. They commanded massive private armies, collected suffocating taxes from the peasants, and built towering, heavily fortified castles that dominated the surrounding landscapes. And standing resolutely on the front lines, serving these regional lords, enforcing their iron will, and fiercely protecting their sprawling lands, were the samurai. They were the loyal teeth and the razor-sharp claws of the ruling elite. By dedicating their entire existence to the art of war, the samurai deliberately elevated themselves far above the common farmers, the skilled artisans, and the wealthy merchants. They became the undisputed, terrifying masters of Japanese society, holding the ultimate power of life and death over the lower classes. It was a brutal, beautiful, and strictly ordered world, and the samurai were the very glue that held it all together through sheer intimidation and unbreakable loyalty. The samurai did not simply materialize out of thin air, fully armored and strictly disciplined, clutching their legendary swords. Their story is a slow, incredibly bloody evolution that spans centuries, born from a desperate need for survival in an untamed frontier. To find their true beginnings, we must look back to the Heian period, around the 8th and 9th centuries. During this era, the imperial court in the capital of Kyoto was entirely consumed by the pursuit of aesthetic perfection. The wealthy, perfumed aristocrats spent their days composing delicate poetry, playing elegant music, and engaging in complex, secretive romances behind sliding paper screens. They viewed the rugged, mountainous provinces outside the capital as a barbaric wasteland, entirely beneath their refined notice. But out in that harsh wilderness, a terrifying threat was brewing. Indigenous tribes in the north, known as the Amishi, fiercely resisted the expansion of the imperial state. The delicate nobles in Kyoto, who considered even the handling of weapons to be spiritually polluting, realized they needed rough, violent men to do their fighting for them. They began recruiting tough, hardened landowners from the eastern provinces, men who had spent their entire lives surviving in the mountains. These early fighters were not the sword-wielding duelists we picture today. They were incredibly skilled horseback archers. Mounted on sturdy, fearless native ponies, they developed a lethal hit-and-run style of warfare, wielding massive, asymmetrical longbows capable of piercing armor from incredible distances. The aristocrats in the capital viewed these warriors merely as crude mercenaries, hired muscle meant to protect wealthy estates, escort tax collectors, and crush rebellions on the frontiers. In fact, the very word samurai originates from the ancient Japanese verb saburao, which simply translates to those who serve. For generations, they were treated as violent, uncultured tools by the central government. But the men on horseback were slowly waking up to a profound realization. They were the ones bleeding and dying in the mud to secure the wealth of the nation, while the soft aristocrats in Kyoto contributed absolutely nothing to their own defense. As the centuries rolled on, the central government's grip on the provinces began to rot from the inside out. The imperial court became so obsessed with internal politics and artistic pursuits that it lost all ability to enforce its own laws. Recognizing this immense vacuum of power, the provincial warrior families began to organize themselves into massive, highly disciplined military clans. Two of these clans rose above all others in sheer numbers and ruthless ambition: the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan. For decades, a bitter, simmering rivalry grew between them, ultimately exploding into one of the most devastating conflicts in Japanese history, the Genpei War, which raged from 1180 to 1185. This was a conflict of apocalyptic proportions, tearing the nation apart as massive armies clashed across the countryside and fleets of wooden warships turned the coastal waters red with blood. The climax of this horrific civil war occurred at the naval battle of Dan-no-Ura. In a swirling, chaotic battle fought over treacherous ocean currents, the Minamoto clan utterly annihilated the Taira. It was a tragic, heartbreaking defeat, culminating in the child emperor of the Taira faction being thrown into the sea by his own grandmother to prevent his capture. With the Taira completely wiped out, the victorious leader of the Minamoto clan, Minamoto no Yoritomo, seized absolute control of the country. He did not depose the emperor. Instead, he did something far more permanent. He established his own military government far away from the distractions of Kyoto, in a coastal town called Kamakura. Yoritomo took the title of shogun, officially cementing the samurai not just as servants, but as the supreme, undisputed rulers of Japan. The age of the courtiers was entirely dead. The brutal, uncompromising age of the warrior had officially begun. For the next several generations, the Kamakura shogunate maintained a tight, disciplined grip on the nation. The samurai solidified their culture, adopting early codes of honor and focusing intensely on their martial prowess. But their ultimate test came not from within Japan, but from across the sea. In the late 13th century, the terrifying, world-conquering Mongol Empire, led by Kublai Khan, turned its hungry eyes toward the Japanese archipelago. The Mongols launched two massive, overwhelming invasion fleets. When the samurai rode out to the beaches to meet them, they were utterly shocked. The samurai were accustomed to a highly ritualized form of warfare, where warriors would ride forward, announce their names and lineage, and seek single combat with a worthy opponent. The Mongols, however, had no interest in honorable duels. They fought in massive, coordinated formations, utilizing terrifying new weapons like explosive ceramic bombs and clouds of poisoned arrows. The samurai fought with desperate, suicidal bravery, completely refusing to yield the beaches, but they were slowly being ground down by the sheer, overwhelming numbers of the Mongol forces. But then, an event occurred that would forever alter the psychology of the Japanese people. On two separate occasions, just as the Mongol fleet seemed poised to deliver the final crushing blow, massive, monstrous typhoons materialized out of the ocean and completely obliterated the invading armadas. Tens of thousands of Mongol soldiers drowned in the raging waters. The Japanese called these miraculous storms the kamikaze, the divine wind, believing with absolute certainty that the gods of Japan had personally intervened to protect their sacred islands. While the samurai had survived the terrifying Mongol threat, the invasions completely bankrupted the Kamakura shogunate. Because the war was defensive, there was no newly conquered land or seized wealth to hand out as rewards to the thousands of samurai who had fought so bravely. Feeling betrayed and deeply impoverished, the warriors eventually turned on the Kamakura government, tearing it down and plunging the nation back into chaos. What followed was the Ashikaga shogunate, a period marked by brilliant cultural achievements but incredibly weak political control. As the authority of the shogun slowly crumbled into irrelevance, The powerful regional lords, the daimyo, began to completely ignore the central government. This absolute breakdown of order culminated in the catastrophic Onin War in 1467, a conflict that burned the ancient capital of Kyoto to the ground and plunged Japan into its darkest, most terrifying era, the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. For more than a century, Japan became a living hell of endless, apocalyptic civil war. It was an era entirely defined by a concept known as Gekkokujo, which translates to the low overthrowing the high. It was a time when the traditional social order was completely inverted. A lowly foot soldier with enough ambition and a sharp spear could assassinate his lord, seize a castle, and declare himself a daimyo. Trust was a fatal weakness. Brothers murdered brothers, sons overthrew fathers, and the noble codes of honor that the samurai supposedly cherished were frequently brutally abandoned in the desperate name of survival. Warfare itself changed dramatically during this blood-soaked century. The elegant, individual combat of the past was replaced by massive, highly disciplined armies of ashigaru, peasant foot soldiers wielding exceptionally long spears. Even more terrifying was the arrival of Portuguese merchants in 1543, who brought with them the matchlock musket. The samurai quickly adopted and mass-produced these firearms, completely revolutionizing battlefield tactics. A peasant who had practiced for only a few weeks could now pull a trigger and instantly kill a samurai who had spent 30 agonizing years mastering the sword. It was an era of pure, unfiltered Darwinism, where only the most cunning and utterly ruthless survived. Yet, out of this terrifying century of endless bloodshed, 3 extraordinary men emerged. They are known to history as the 3 great unifiers. The first was Oda Nobunaga, a brilliant, terrifyingly ruthless warlord who embraced the new firearms and utilized brutal, uncompromising tactics to crush his rivals. He began the bloody process of unifying the fractured nation, but was tragically betrayed and forced to commit ritual suicide by one of his own generals. The incredibly difficult task of unification was then taken up by his most capable commander, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi was a fascinating historical anomaly. A man born as a lowly, uneducated peasant who rose through the ranks purely through his terrifying intellect and unmatched military genius to become the supreme ruler of Japan. To ensure that no one could ever overthrow him the way he had overthrown others, Hideyoshi initiated the Great Sword Hunt, sending his armies to confiscate every single weapon from the peasant class. He effectively froze the social hierarchy in place, drawing a permanent, uncrossable line between the farmers who worked the land and the samurai who ruled it. But it was the third unifier, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would finally secure the future. Ieyasu was a master of extreme patience, a brilliant political strategist who waited decades for the perfect moment to strike. After Hideyoshi's death, the country split into 2 massive factions. In the year 1600, these 2 colossal armies collided at the Battle of Sekigahara. It was the largest, most decisive battle in Japanese history. Through a combination of brilliant tactics and highly orchestrated last-minute betrayals by enemy generals, Ieyasu emerged entirely victorious. 3 years later, he was officially granted the title of shogun, and he established a new, terrifyingly efficient government in the swampy fishing village of Edo, which would eventually become the sprawling metropolis of Tokyo. The Tokugawa shogunate achieved what was previously thought to be completely impossible. They instituted highly draconian laws, strictly controlled the daimyo, and eventually closed Japan's borders to the outside world in a policy of absolute isolation known as sakoku. They locked the nation into an era of forced, unyielding peace that would miraculously last for over 250 years. But for the samurai, this profound peace was a terrifying existential crisis. The men whose entire genetic and psychological makeup was perfectly engineered for warfare suddenly found themselves completely obsolete. The armor was packed away in wooden chests. The magnificent, razor-sharp swords became mere symbols of status rather than tools of survival. To maintain their position at the very top of society, the fearsome, blood-soaked warriors of the Sengoku Jidai were forced to completely reinvent themselves. They had to transition from being the lethal killers of the battlefield to becoming the highly educated bureaucrats, administrators, and scholars of a pacified, strictly ordered nation. It was a profound, deeply unsettling transformation that would test the very limits of what it truly meant to carry the name of the samurai. The transition from a terrifying life of constant, unpredictable warfare to a highly structured era of complete national peace fundamentally altered the very DNA of what it meant to be a samurai. Imagine a weapon forged in the hottest, most violent fires, suddenly placed on a velvet cushion, and told to remain perfectly still for over 250 years. This was the profound existential crisis of the Tokugawa period. Without sprawling military campaigns to fight, without rival castles to besiege or enemy heads to claim, the daily existence of the armored warrior was heavily reorganized and bound by a staggering, almost suffocating array of bureaucratic rules, social expectations, and rigid etiquette. The men whose ancestors had waded through the blood and mud of the Warring States period were now forced to commute to their lord's castle every single day to essentially act as accountants, magistrates, and civil servants. They were a warrior class completely deprived of war, constantly training for a battle that would never actually come. Yet, even in this era of profound, unyielding peace, the ghost of the battlefield hovered over every single aspect of their daily routine. Discipline was the absolute, unshakable foundation of their existence. To show laziness, to be disorganized, or to display a lack of physical and mental fortitude was considered an unforgivable moral failure that brought immediate shame upon one's entire family line. A samurai's morning began in absolute darkness, long before the sun even considered rising over the horizon. Upon waking, the very first act of the day was a ritual of purification. A samurai would immediately step outside into the biting morning air to wash his face and hands with freezing cold water. This was not merely about basic physical hygiene, it was a deeply ingrained spiritual practice known as misogi, designed to forcefully wash away the lingering lethargy of sleep and perfectly clarify the mind for the heavy duties of the day. Following this cold purification, the meticulous and incredibly painful process of grooming began. A samurai's hair was his ultimate symbol of status, and it had to be arranged into the traditional topknot, known as the shanmage. Originally, this distinct hairstyle had a very practical, brutal purpose on the battlefield. The top of the head was shaved completely bald to prevent the warrior from overheating while wearing a heavy iron helmet during the sweltering Japanese summers, while the remaining hair was oiled, tied up, and folded forward to create a cushion that kept the heavy helmet stable. But in times of total peace, when helmets were packed away in dusty chests, the shaved pate and oiled topknot remained as an inescapable, highly visible badge of their social class. Since modern razors did not exist, the hair on the top of the head was often painfully plucked out with wooden tweezers or scraped away with a rudimentary blade, a process the samurai endured in absolute, unflinching silence. After dressing in their everyday cotton or silk kimono, the next mandatory duty was to kneel before the household altar. Here, they would light incense, bow deeply, and pay their profound respects to the spirits of their ancestors, quietly reporting their intentions for the day and asking for the strength to maintain the heavy, unyielding honor of the family name. Despite their elevated social status at the very top of the hierarchy, the day-to-day financial reality for the vast majority of samurai during the peaceful Edo period was surprisingly grim and incredibly stressful. They were not paid in shining gold coins or silver ingots, but almost exclusively in rice. A samurai's wealth and social rank were measured entirely by a unit known as the koku. One koku was officially defined as the exact amount of rice necessary to feed one adult man for an entire year, which equated to roughly 150 kilograms. The regional lords, the daimyo, would collect massive amounts of rice from the peasant farmers as taxes, and then distribute these rice stipends to their loyal retainers based on their rank and hereditary status. This system worked perfectly well in a feudal, agrarian society, but the Tokugawa period brought about massive urbanization and the rapid development of a complex, cash-based economy. The samurai could not pay for their children's education, the maintenance of their swords, or the repair of their homes with sacks of raw rice. They were forcefully required to take their stipends to designated rice brokers in major cities like Osaka and Edo, where they would exchange their honorable rice for actual currency. As the centuries of peace dragged on, a devastating economic inversion occurred. The merchant class, who were traditionally placed at the absolute bottom of the Confucian social hierarchy because they produced nothing of their own and merely profited off the labor of others, grew phenomenally, astronomically wealthy. They controlled the exchange rates, manipulated the markets, and lived in luxurious, hidden opulence. Meanwhile, the proud samurai, whose rice stipends were strictly fixed and rarely ever increased despite the skyrocketing inflation of city life, slowly and inevitably fell into crushing, inescapable debt to the very merchants they technically ruled over. This economic reality created a massive, heartbreaking divide in how the samurai actually lived. The high-ranking samurai, the senior advisors to the daimyo, lived in sprawling, breathtakingly elegant estates perfectly situated near the center of the city. Their homes were magnificent examples of traditional Japanese architecture, featuring sweeping tiled roofs, beautiful sliding paper doors called fusuma, floors completely covered in fragrant, tightly woven tatami mats, and meticulously manicured Zen gardens designed to promote deep philosophical contemplation. These vast estates were fortified with high stone walls and heavy wooden gates, standing as permanent monuments to the clan's power and prestige. However, the vast majority of the warrior class consisted of low-ranking samurai, foot soldiers, and minor clerks. Their living conditions were a stark, desperate contrast to the elite. These men lived in the outer edges of the castle towns in cramped, drafty, unpainted wooden houses that frequently suffered from leaking roofs and rotting floorboards. To survive on their pitiful stipends, these fierce warriors were forced to secretly cultivate small vegetable gardens in their dirt courtyards, growing radishes and sweet potatoes just to keep their families from starving. It was considered deeply humiliating for a samurai to work with his hands for money, yet behind closed doors, hidden from the judgmental eyes of their superiors, many impoverished samurai and their wives desperately engaged in menial piecework. They would spend their evenings folding paper umbrellas, making bamboo bird cages, or crafting toothpicks by the dim light of a single oil lamp, desperately trying to earn just a few extra copper coins to survive the winter. It was a life of profound, quiet desperation, a daily psychological torture where a frayed kimono collar or a visibly worn sword scabbard was a source of deep, silent, agonizing shame. They were forced to maintain the terrifying, arrogant facade of ruling nobility while secretly drowning in an ocean of inescapable poverty. Their daily diet reflected this massive economic divide. The common perception of Japanese food today involves massive amounts of fresh sushi and expensive ingredients, but the historical samurai diet was fundamentally austere, heavily influenced by Zen Buddhist principles and the sheer necessity of their economic limitations. White, highly polished rice was the absolute staple of their existence, a profound symbol of status and purity. However, a diet consisting almost exclusively of white rice lacked essential vitamins, leading to rampant outbreaks of a debilitating, sometimes fatal nerve disease known as beriberi, which the Japanese tellingly called Edo Wazurai, or the sickness of Edo. To accompany their precious rice, they typically consumed simple, fermented side dishes designed to preserve food through the harsh winters. A standard meal consisted of a steaming bowl of rich miso soup, a small serving of highly salted pickled vegetables known as tsukemono, and occasionally a small piece of dried or grilled fish. The consumption of red meat, such as beef or pork, was strictly forbidden and highly taboo, both due to Buddhist prohibitions against the killing of four-legged animals and the practical reality that grazing animals took up precious land needed for growing rice. They drank copious amounts of hot green tea throughout the day, valuing its slightly bitter taste and its ability to keep the mind incredibly sharp and focused. On special occasions, or to relieve the intense crushing pressure of their heavily regulated lives, samurai would consume sake, a potent rice wine. Sake was deeply woven into their culture, utilized in religious ceremonies, political alliances, and moments of quiet camaraderie. However, public drunkenness was generally frowned upon, as a warrior was expected to maintain absolute, terrifying control over his faculties at all times, lest he accidentally offend a superior or unconsciously reach for his deadly blade in a moment of clouded judgment. The family structure within these households was entirely and rigidly governed by the strict, unyielding principles of Confucian patriarchy. The individual, as we understand the concept today, simply did not exist. A person was merely a single, replaceable link in the long, unbroken chain of the family lineage. The head of the household, the father or the eldest son, wielded absolute, unquestionable authority over every single person living under his roof. His word was literal law, and disobedience was unthinkable. Marriages were almost never about romance, personal affection, or physical attraction. They were highly calculated, deeply strategic political alliances, meticulously negotiated by third-party matchmakers to strengthen a family's social standing, secure a vital promotion within the clan bureaucracy, or heal a lingering rift between rival factions. A young samurai and his future bride might only see each other's faces once or twice in a highly formal, strictly supervised meeting before they were permanently bound together for the rest of their lives. Upon marriage, the bride entirely left her own family behind, legally and spiritually becoming a permanent member of her husband's clan. She was expected to serve her husband, her deeply demanding mother-in-law, and the absolute honor of her new family name with unwavering, silent devotion. However, to look at this intensely patriarchal structure and assume that the women of the samurai class were fragile, powerless, or entirely subjugated dolls would be a massive, completely inaccurate historical mistake. The women of this elite warrior class were forged in the exact same fire of duty and honor as the men. They were known as onamusha when they took up arms, and their spirit was incredibly fierce, utterly indomitable, and deeply respected. While the men were away at war, or during the peaceful Edo period, spending half the year serving the Lord in the distant capital under the mandatory hostage system known as Sankin Kotai, the women were left as the absolute, undisputed rulers of the household. They were incredibly highly educated, managing the highly complex, often completely desperate financial ledgers of the estate, overseeing the strict discipline of the servants, directing the crucial agricultural work on their lands, and taking full, unyielding responsibility for the education of the next generation of warriors. A samurai mother was expected to raise her sons to be utterly fearless in the face of death, purposely instilling in them a cold, hard psychological resilience from the very moment they could walk. But their duties went far beyond mere domestic management. They were the absolute last line of lethal defense for the home. Samurai women were heavily and rigorously trained from a very young age in the deadly martial arts, primarily mastering the use of the naginata. The naginata was a terrifyingly effective weapon, consisting of a long, sturdy wooden pole tipped with a razor-sharp, heavily curved steel blade. It was perfectly, ingeniously suited for a smaller defender, allowing a woman to utilize leverage and sweeping, circular momentum to keep much larger, heavier, and stronger male attackers at a safe, lethal distance. If an enemy clan attempted to raid the estate, or if the castle was actively besieged, the women did not cower in the inner rooms. They tied back their long hair, bound their heavy kimono sleeves tightly with silk cords, and took up defensive positions at the wooden gates, fully prepared to kill and be killed alongside the men. They carried a smaller, deadly straight-bladed dagger, known as a kaiken, carefully hidden within the folds of their kimono. This dagger was not meant solely for striking an enemy who managed to get too close. It served a much darker, far more intimate purpose: If the castle walls finally fell and the estate was violently overrun, a samurai woman knew exactly what was expected of her. Rather than submit to the unbearable shame of capture, physical defilement, or seeing her children brutally tortured by enemy soldiers, she was deeply trained to commit a specific, highly ritualized form of suicide known as jigai. Unlike the men who sliced open their abdomens, a woman would use her kaikin to swiftly and deeply sever the jugular vein in her own neck, ensuring a rapid, honorable death. But even in this final, terrifying moment of supreme agony, decorum and dignity were absolutely paramount. Before striking the fatal blow, she would meticulously use a silk sash to tie her own knees tightly together, ensuring that when her lifeless body finally collapsed to the blood-soaked floor, she would fall in a perfectly composed, dignified posture, completely preserving her honor and the honor of her clan, even in the cold, silent grip of death. This was the true, terrifying reality of the samurai family. It was a daily existence totally saturated in the heavy, inescapable burden of duty, where every single member of the household, regardless of their gender, was expected to live, breathe, and ultimately die for the absolute, unyielding pride of the name they carried. To look at the samurai simply as heavily armed enforcers or wealthy bureaucrats is to entirely miss the beating heart of their existence. They were practitioners of a lifestyle governed by an unspoken, unwritten, yet overwhelmingly powerful moral atmosphere known as Bushido, which translates elegantly to the way of the warrior. It is crucial to understand that for most of their history, Bushido was not a neatly organized single book of laws that a young samurai could simply memorize. Instead, it was an invisible, inescapable cultural gravity. It was a rigorous set of moral principles passed down through generations, demanding absolute, unquestioning loyalty, extreme self-discipline, and a complete, almost terrifying indifference to physical pain and personal suffering. At the very core of this philosophy was the concept of loyalty, a devotion so deep that it completely erased the concept of the individual ego. A samurai firmly believed that he did not actually belong to himself. His life, his body, and his honor were the absolute property of his lord. If the lord commanded a samurai to march directly into certain death, the only acceptable, honorable response was profound gratitude for the glorious opportunity to serve. The most famous philosophical text on the samurai mindset, the Hagakure, states quite plainly that the way of the samurai is found in death. This was not a morbid obsession with dying, but rather a highly sophisticated psychological tool. The samurai were taught to mentally accept their own deaths every single morning. By internally visualizing their own demise, by imagining themselves being struck by arrows, cut down by swords, or swept away by fire, they completely eradicated the paralyzing fear of mortality. When a warrior stepped onto the battlefield already believing he was a dead man, he was completely liberated from hesitation, fighting with a terrifying, fluid perfection that made him infinitely more dangerous. This absolute devotion to duty was practiced, refined, and perfected through a relentless, agonizing dedication to the martial arts. These physical disciplines were not merely viewed as ways to efficiently kill an enemy. They were profound, moving meditations designed to strip away the conscious mind. Consider kenjutsu, the traditional art of the sword. A samurai would not just practice a few strikes. He would perform tens of thousands of repetitions with a heavy wooden practice sword known as a bakken. He would swing until his hands bled, his muscles screamed, and his mind completely went blank. The ultimate goal was to remove the dangerous, crippling hesitation of conscious thought. In a life-or-death duel, if you have to think about how to block a strike or where to place your feet, you are already dead. Through decades of agonizing repetition, the sword became an organic extension of the warrior's own arm, allowing his body to react to a lethal threat with the effortless, unthinking speed of a reflex. Similarly, Kyudo, the way of the bow, was elevated into an almost mystical, deeply spiritual practice. The Japanese yumi is a massive, asymmetrical longbow, taller than the man firing it. Drawing this weapon required immense physical strength. But physical strength was entirely secondary to mental clarity. A master of Kyudo does not consciously decide to release the bowstring. Instead, he draws the string to its absolute maximum tension, aligns his breathing with the universe, and waits in a state of perfect, empty stillness. He waits until the release happens entirely naturally, entirely on its own, like a heavy burden of snow finally slipping off a bent bamboo leaf. If the mind is perfectly clear and the spirit is completely aligned, the arrow will inevitably find the target without the archer ever having to try. Yet, the true enduring genius of samurai culture was its uncompromising demand for balance. A warrior who only studied the brutal mechanics of war was considered incomplete, viewed as a dangerous, uncultured brute rather than a noble leader. They fervently embraced a philosophical concept known as Bunbu Ryodo, which translates to the dual way of the pen and the sword. It was deeply believed that studying the delicate, refined arts actually made a man a far more lethal and effective warrior, as it cultivated a highly sensitive, intensely observant, and perfectly calm mind. It is a stunning paradox that a man whose hands were heavily calloused from gripping a weapon of war would spend his quiet evenings gently and meticulously whisking bright green matcha in a shadowy, utterly silent tea room. The Japanese tea ceremony, known as channoyu, was an absolute masterclass in mindfulness and forced humility. The tea houses were intentionally designed to be small, rustic, and completely isolated from the chaotic outside world. To enter the tea room, a samurai had to crawl through a tiny lowered door, known as a nijiriguchi. This was a profoundly symbolic act. It forced everyone, from the lowest retainer to the highest-ranking daimyo, to physically bow and humble themselves. More importantly, the samurai was strictly required to leave his razor-sharp swords outside the door. Inside the tea room, all men were equal, and the violence of the world was entirely forbidden. The ceremony itself was an intricate, mesmerizing ritual, where every single minute movement was performed with total, unwavering presence. The careful folding of the silk cloth, the precise pouring of the boiling water that sounded exactly like the wind blowing through ancient pines, the slow turning of the rough clay bowl. It was a deeply spiritual performance designed to force the warrior to appreciate the fleeting, perfect beauty of the present moment. This acute sensitivity to the impermanence of life naturally flowed from the tea room into the realm of literature. The samurai poured their deeply conflicted souls into calligraphy and poetry, particularly mastering the short, highly evocative format of the haiku. Calligraphy was considered a direct mirror of the soul. The way a warrior applied black ink to pristine white paper, the pressure, the speed, the violent slashes, and the delicate fading trails, revealed his true character far more accurately than any spoken words. A beautifully written poem was valued just as highly as a perfectly executed lethal sword strike. The ultimate expression of this literary devotion was the jisei, or the death poem. It was expected that when a samurai was facing his final moments, whether he was bleeding out on a chaotic battlefield or preparing to commit ritual suicide in a silent courtyard, he would possess the supernatural emotional control to compose a final, profound poem. These death poems rarely mentioned war, hatred, or the enemy. Instead, with their final breaths, these hardened killers would write breathtakingly beautiful lines about the falling autumn leaves, the melting winter snow, or the fading light of the moon, peacefully accepting their own demise as a natural, beautiful part of the universe's grand, eternal cycle. It takes an entirely different kind of courage to look death squarely in the eyes and respond with a delicate observation about a cherry blossom. Nowhere was this incredible, almost obsessive blend of lethal function and breathtaking artistic beauty more physically visible than in the equipment they carried into battle. The samurai armor, the yoroi, was an absolute masterpiece of ancient engineering, designed to be both highly protective and utterly terrifying. Unlike the rigid, heavy plate armor of European knights, which turned men into lumbering tanks, samurai armor was designed for extreme mobility. It was meticulously constructed from hundreds of small, individually lacquered iron or heavy leather scales, all painstakingly laced together with incredibly vibrant, heavy silk cords. This allowed the armor to be highly flexible, ensuring the warrior could still gracefully draw a bow or violently swing a sword while fully protected. The colors of the silk lacing were not arbitrary. They prominently displayed the warrior's clan allegiance, turning the battlefield into a shifting, chaotic sea of brilliant crimson, deep indigo, and stark white. But the most psychologically devastating element of the armor was the helmet, the kabuto, and the accompanying face mask, the menpo. These masks were expertly forged from iron and designed to strip the enemy of their courage before the very first blow was ever struck. They were sculpted into the terrifying visages of angry ghosts, snarling demons, or fierce deities, often featuring bristling horsehair mustaches, aggressively flared nostrils, and bared, golden teeth. When a samurai tied that mask onto his face, he was symbolically leaving his human empathy behind and transforming himself into an avatar of pure divine destruction. But the absolute undisputed center of a samurai's entire universe, the physical manifestation of his honor and his authority, was his sword. The katana was never viewed simply as a piece of sharpened metal or a mere tool for killing. It was literally and deeply believed to be the living soul of the warrior who carried it. The creation of a katana was an incredibly sacred, highly spiritual endeavor that could take months of agonizing, back-breaking labor to complete. The master swordsmiths were not just blacksmiths. They were highly revered Shinto priests. Before stepping into the forge, the smith would undergo strict purification rituals, fasting and standing naked beneath freezing waterfalls to cleanse his spirit, ensuring that no dark or malicious energy could accidentally pass from his hands into the steel. The forging process itself was a marvel of ancient metallurgy. Using a specialized, incredibly pure iron sand known as tamehagane, the smith would repeatedly heat, hammer, and fold the steel thousands of times. This exhaustive folding process removed any microscopic impurities and evenly distributed the carbon, creating a blade that was unbelievably resilient and completely resistant to shattering. However, a sword needs to be more than just tough. It must be lethally sharp. To achieve this, the smith employed a brilliant, highly dangerous technique known as differential hardening. He would carefully coat the spine of the blade in a thick layer of insulating clay, leaving only a very thin layer along the cutting edge. When the glowing, red-hot sword was suddenly plunged into cold water, the exposed edge cooled almost instantly, forming an incredibly hard, microscopic crystalline structure capable of holding an impossibly sharp edge. Meanwhile, the clay-coated spine cooled much more slowly, remaining relatively soft and flexible. This miraculous combination meant the katana could effortlessly cleave through flesh and bone without snapping under the immense shock of the impact. This hardening process also created the heimin, the beautiful, undulating, frosty temper line that runs along the edge of every genuine Japanese sword, serving as the unique, permanent fingerprint of the master smith who birthed it. A fully ranked samurai did not just carry one sword, he proudly carried two, a pairing explicitly known as the daisho. He wore the long, elegant katana, intended for open combat and wide, sweeping strikes, alongside the much shorter wakizashi, which was perfectly suited for highly restricted, close-quarters fighting indoors or in tight alleyways. Only a true samurai was permitted by absolute law to wear the daisho in public. When a samurai walked through the crowded streets of the capital or a bustling provincial village, the presence of those two blades thrust through his silk sash commanded immediate, terrifying respect from every single commoner who saw them. They were the ultimate shining symbols of his terrifying, unchecked authority. The daisho represented his absolute power of life and death over the lower classes, but they also represented his heavy, inescapable burden. The very weapons that gave him supreme power were exactly the same weapons that demanded his absolute perfection. To draw a katana without a just and honorable cause was a profound, unforgivable disgrace. To leave it rusting in its scabbard was a sign of a decaying soul. The sword was a mirror, constantly reflecting the true nature of the man who carried it. demanding that he live his life with the exact same unyielding strength, pristine clarity, and lethal perfection as the folded steel resting silently at his hip. The mind that guided the lethal blade was not a simple, unthinking mechanism of destruction. It was meticulously shaped, sharpened, and deeply anchored by a complex, layered spiritual world that provided both psychological comfort and terrifying, unyielding conviction. The samurai did not follow a single dogmatic religion. Instead, their incredibly unique worldview was forged in the intensely burning fires of three overlapping, yet profoundly different philosophies: Shinto, Confucianism, and Zen Buddhism. From Japan's ancient, native religion of Shinto, the samurai inherited a profound, inescapable reverence for the natural world and an intimately deep connection to their own ancestors. Shinto does not possess a single heavy holy book or a defined omnipotent creator god. Rather, it teaches that divine spirits, known as kami, reside actively in absolutely everything. They live in the ancient, twisting roots of massive cedar trees, the rushing, freezing waters of mountain rivers, and the jagged, mist-shrouded peaks of the highest, unapproachable mountains. This deeply ingrained animistic belief instilled in the warrior a profound, almost overwhelming respect for the physical land they were relentlessly fighting for. To a samurai, the soil of Japan was not just dirt and rock. It was literally sacred ground, constantly pulsating with the divine energy of the gods. Furthermore, Shinto fostered the absolute certainty that the unseen spirits of their dead ancestors were constantly, eternally watching them from the shadows. These ancestral spirits acted as a permanent, invisible audience to every single action a warrior took, both in the glaring sunlight of the battlefield and the quiet darkness of his own home. To fail in one's duty, or to act with even a moment of cowardice, was not just a temporary personal embarrassment. It was a cosmic, agonizing disgrace that directly shamed the entire bloodline, violently disrupting the spiritual harmony of the grandfathers and great-grandfathers who had fought and bled before them. This meant that every swing of the sword and every quiet command given carried the immense, crushing weight of permanent spiritual consequence. If Shinto provided the samurai with a profound emotional connection to the land and their lineage, it was the philosophy of Confucianism, imported centuries earlier from ancient China, that provided the strict, unyielding social blueprint for their daily, structured existence. Confucianism fundamentally revolves around the vital concept of hierarchical harmony, heavily emphasizing the paramount importance of structured relationships and absolute, unquestioning loyalty to one's societal superiors. It taught that a peaceful, functional society relies entirely on everyone knowing their exact, unmovable place and strictly fulfilling their specific duties without a single breath of complaint. For the samurai, this translated directly into the 5 constant relationships, with the absolute most crucial being the dynamic between the ruler and the subject, or the regional lord and his sworn retainer. In the highly conditioned mind of the warrior, this specific relationship superseded all others, entirely eclipsing even the profound biological bond between a father and his son, or the intimate connection between a husband and his wife. A samurai was systematically raised from childhood to believe that his lord was a living extension of divine, worldly authority, and therefore, pure obedience to the lord was the ultimate moral imperative. If a daimyo ordered his most loyal retainer to instantly leave his family, forfeit his entire wealth, or even end his own life in the courtyard, Confucian principles dictated that the retainer must do so immediately, gracefully, and without a single moment of visible hesitation or internal resentment. This staggering, terrifying level of devotion essentially weaponized the concept of duty, transforming the samurai into a perfectly compliant, lethally effective instrument of the ruling state. The individual desires, the personal dreams, and the physical comfort of the warrior were considered entirely irrelevant when actively weighed against the massive, overwhelming demands of the clan. Confucianism built the rigid, unbending spine of the samurai code, permanently turning a chaotic band of armed men into a highly disciplined, terrifyingly cohesive military aristocracy that could govern an entire nation through sheer, unyielding structure. But neither the ancestral reverence of Shinto nor the rigid social structures of Confucianism fully explain how a human being can consciously, willingly step into a chaotic, screaming storm of flying arrows and razor-sharp steel without immediately succumbing to paralyzing terror. For that profound, almost supernatural psychological conditioning, the samurai turned to the austere, completely uncompromising teachings of Zen Buddhism. When modern people think of Zen today, they often picture peaceful, smiling monks, carefully raking sand gardens or sitting quietly in tranquil, incense-filled temples, seeking a gentle inner peace. But to the historical samurai, Zen was an incredibly harsh, entirely practical mental technology, designed perfectly for survival in the face of imminent, violently painful death. Zen completely strips away the intellectual complexities of traditional Buddhism, discarding the extensive, lifelong study of religious scriptures and the hopeful reliance on divine salvation in an afterlife. Instead, it forcefully demands absolute, unfiltered presence in the current, agonizingly real moment. Zen teaches that the past is a rapidly fading illusion that can never be changed. The future is an entirely unwritten fantasy that may never arrive, and the only true, undeniable reality is the exact fleeting fraction of a second you are experiencing right now. For a warrior facing a lethal sword strike, getting distracted by the lingering regret of a past mistake or paralyzing himself with the overwhelming fear of future pain means instant, inevitable death. Through Zen meditation, known as Zazen, the samurai learned how to violently sever the agonizing chains of human attachment, specifically targeting the overwhelming, deep-seated biological attachment to their own physical lives. They would sit for agonizingly long hours in perfectly motionless meditation. During Zazen, senior monks would silently patrol the meditation hall carrying a flat wooden stick called a keisaku. If a samurai's posture slumped even slightly, or if his concentration visibly wavered, the monk would strike him sharply across the shoulders, a sudden, stinging physical blow serving as a stark reminder to instantly drag his wandering consciousness back to the brutal, unadorned reality of the present moment. This intense, highly grueling meditative practice was specifically designed to cultivate a highly sought-after, incredibly rare psychological state known as mushin, which translates perfectly to no mind. Mushin is not a state of being unconscious, asleep, or intellectually vacant. Rather, it is a state of absolute, pure mental clarity where the fragile human ego is completely extinguished. In the terrifying, bloody sensory overload of a battlefield, a warrior operating with a conscious, thinking mind is fatally slow. If he actively thinks about how to precisely parry a spear thrust, if he consciously worries about whether the silk cords of his armor will hold against a blade, or if he feels a sudden, blinding surge of anger toward his enemy, his physical reactions will be critically delayed by vital milliseconds. And in a blindingly fast sword duel, a millisecond is the exact, terrifying difference between breathing and bleeding out rapidly in the mud. By achieving the empty state of mushin, a samurai effectively bypassed his conscious brain entirely. His heavily trained, exhausted body would simply react to the lethal threats with the fluid, effortless perfection of a natural reflex. He would not actively decide to swing the sword. The sword would simply swing itself through the open air. He would not consciously dodge the incoming arrow. His body would effortlessly, naturally move out of the lethal trajectory before his eyes even consciously registered the projectile. Zen provided the samurai with the ultimate, terrifying armor, an absolute, chilling indifference to his own survival. When a warrior has completely, genuinely accepted that he is already a dead man walking, he is entirely liberated from the crippling restrictions of human fear, allowing him to step forward and fight with a terrifying, ghost-like efficiency that absolutely shattered the psychological morale of lesser men. This incredibly complex, multi-layered spiritual worldview culminated in a profoundly beautiful, yet incredibly melancholic cultural aesthetic known as mono no aware, which translates to a deep, heartbreakingly empathetic awareness of the impermanence of all things in the universe. Because Zen Buddhism heavily emphasized the fleeting, entirely temporary nature of physical reality, the samurai developed an intense, almost obsessive emotional appreciation for things that were brilliantly beautiful, but utterly destined to fade away quickly. This exact philosophical viewpoint is precisely why the delicate cherry blossom, the sakura, became the absolute enduring symbol of the terrifying samurai class. A cherry blossom does not cling desperately to the branch as it slowly rots, withers, and turns brown. Instead, it blooms with breathtaking, magnificent vibrancy for only a few short, glorious days. And then, at the absolute height of its pristine perfection, it gracefully allows itself to be effortlessly swept away by the slightest gentle breeze, falling to the earth like fragrant pink snow. To the samurai, watching the petals fall was the ultimate, perfect metaphor for an honorable, untainted life. A warrior was fully expected to live brilliantly, burn brightly with absolute loyalty, and then gracefully, quietly accept his inevitable end without a single shred of desperate clinging or undignified, cowardly struggle. It was an incredibly heavy, profoundly demanding way to exist, requiring these men to constantly, delicately balance the terrifying, bloody violence of their chosen profession with a deeply sensitive, beautifully poetic soul. This unique spiritual trinity of Shinto, Confucianism, and Zen Buddhism did not just teach the samurai how to efficiently and ruthlessly take lives. It taught them, with breathtakingly profound depth, exactly how to let go of their own. Beneath the exquisite poetry, the refined tea ceremonies, and the profound Zen philosophy lay a much darker, fundamentally violent reality. The samurai's absolute, uncompromising obsession with honor gave rise to several unique, highly extreme practices that completely defy modern comprehension. To understand these men, we must be willing to respectfully but truthfully examine the darkest corners of their culture, where duty and violence intersected in deeply unsettling ways. The most famous, and perhaps the most misunderstood of these practices is seppuku, the excruciating act of ritual suicide. In the West, suicide is often historically viewed as a desperate escape, an act of ultimate surrender or profound despair. But to the samurai, seppuku was the exact opposite. It was a profound assertion of absolute control, the ultimate, undeniable proof of a warrior's unwavering courage, and the final, agonizing method used to restore a stained honor. But why specifically the abdomen? The ancient Japanese believed that the human soul, the true, unfiltered intentions, and the deepest emotional core of a person did not reside in the head or the heart, but rather deep within the stomach, a spiritual center heavily guarded by flesh, known as the hara. By physically slicing open his own abdomen, a samurai was literally laying his inner soul bare for the world to see, silently proving through unimaginable agony that his intentions were pure and his courage was absolute. The mechanics of this gruesome ritual were intensely structured, deeply respected, and heavily codified. A samurai condemned to commit seppuku, or choosing to do so to follow his fallen lord into death, was afforded immense respect. He would be carefully bathed, dressed in a pristine white kimono symbolizing pure, untainted intentions, and served his favorite meal. He would then be seated on a special square of white silk in a quiet, heavily guarded courtyard, or a silent temple hall. Placed gently before him on a wooden tray would be a short blade, typically a wakizashi or a specially wrapped tanto dagger. In these final, terrifying moments, he was fully expected to maintain absolute emotional control, using dark ink and a fine brush to compose a beautiful, serene death poem. Once the poem was complete, he would carefully open his kimono, pick up the short blade, and plunge it deeply into the left side of his stomach, drawing it slowly and agonizingly across to the right, and then often pulling it violently upward. The physical pain of this act is entirely unimaginable, yet the warrior was expected to endure it without uttering a single scream or allowing his face to contort in undignified agony. Because dying from this specific self-inflicted wound is incredibly slow and excruciating, a trusted friend or highly skilled swordsman stood directly behind him, acting as the kaishakunin, or the second. At the exact moment of ultimate agony, just as the blade finished its horrifying path, the kaishakunin would swing his katana to swiftly decapitate the dying samurai. But even this fatal swing was subject to extreme, terrifying perfection. The perfect cut was completely designed to leave a thin, tiny band of flesh at the front of the throat, miraculously ensuring that the heavy head would fall respectfully forward into the samurai's lap, rather than rolling violently and disrespectfully across the pristine floor. This intense, deeply ingrained focus on the physical head extends directly into the grim, terrifying reality of battlefield combat. In the chaotic, blood-soaked days of the Sengoku period, a samurai was not rewarded merely for participating bravely in a battle. His wealth, his land, and his social rank depended entirely on providing absolute physical proof of his lethal exploits. That undeniable proof came exclusively in the horrifying form of severed enemy heads. Taking the head of a high-ranking rival warrior was the ultimate, highly sought-after prize, leading to a macabre, highly organized post-battle ritual known as the head viewing ceremony. After the dust settled and the agonizing screams faded from the blackened battlefield, the severed heads were carefully collected and brought back to the victor's heavily guarded camp. Here, a deeply unsettling preparation took place, a gruesome task that often forcefully fell upon the women of the victorious clan. They were tasked with meticulously washing the mud and dried blood from the severed heads, carefully combing the matted hair back into a neat traditional top knot, and, incredibly, applying a light cosmetic powder and blackening the teeth of the dead men, a highly aristocratic cosmetic practice of the time. This was done out of a bizarre sense of deep, warriorly respect, ensuring the fallen enemy looked appropriately noble and presentable before being officially judged. A small wooden tag detailing the victim's name and the specific warrior who bravely killed him would be securely attached to the ear or the hair. The daimyo would then sit on a raised wooden dais, surrounded by his victorious generals, as the heavily groomed heads were formally presented on spiked wooden planks. The lord would closely inspect the horrifying trophies, deeply praising the warriors who had claimed them, and distributing increased rice stipends and lands based entirely on the macabre harvest laid before him. It was a completely normalized, deeply institutionalized commodification of human life, where a man's severed face literally became the bloody currency of promotion. Yet, perhaps the most terrifying and heavily controversial practice of all occurred not on the muddy, chaotic battlefields, but in the dark, silent streets of the major cities. The samurai carried swords of unimaginable sharpness, weapons forged over months of painstaking religious labor, but a newly forged sword's true lethality could only be proven through actual physical cutting. This dark necessity led to an incredibly horrifying phenomenon known as tsujigiri, which roughly translates to crossroads killing. In the early, highly unstable days of the samurai, a warrior who had just purchased a brand new katana might step out into the pitch-black streets late at night, hiding quietly near a desolate, unlit crossroads. He would wait in the suffocating silence for an innocent, unarmed commoner, perhaps a merchant returning home late, or a weary peasant traveler, to walk by. Without a single word of warning, the samurai would draw his new blade and strike the unsuspecting victim down in the dark, simply to test the balance and the cutting edge of the expensive steel. Because samurai had the absolute legal right to strike down commoners who deeply offended them, these nocturnal murders were incredibly difficult to prosecute and often went entirely unpunished. The sheer terror of knowing that a silent shadow in the alleyway could instantly end your life just to test a piece of metal permanently haunted the common class. As the Tokugawa shogunate eventually brought unyielding peace and strict law to the nation, The horrific practice of tsujigiri was universally outlawed and brutally punished by death. However, the deep traditional need to test the blades remained. The practice slowly evolved into tameshigiri, where professional, highly skilled sword testers were officially employed by the government to test new weapons on the completely lifeless bodies of freshly executed criminals. They would stack the corpses and test precisely how many human bodies a single powerful swing could cleanly sever. The horrifying results of these macabre tests were proudly, permanently engraved onto the tang of the sword under the handle, acting as a grim, undeniable certificate of the weapon's terrifying authenticity. These dark, extreme practices, the agonizing, self-inflicted wounds of seppuku, the horrifying, ritualized battlefield head viewings, and the nocturnal terror of testing blades on innocent flesh, starkly illuminate the incredibly heavy, terrifying cost of living in a society where martial honor and the absolute perfection of violence completely eclipsed basic human empathy. The long, heavily enforced peace of the Tokugawa shogunate could not last forever. The twilight of the samurai did not arrive with a glorious, honorable clash of swords, but rather with the terrifying, suffocating black smoke of foreign coal. In July of 1853, a fleet of heavily armed American steamships, commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry, forced its way into Edo Bay. The Japanese called them the Black Ships. These massive iron-hulled vessels, bristling with devastating modern cannons, were a brutal, inescapable wake-up call. The samurai, whose primary weapons were still the sword and the outdated matchlock musket, realized with absolute horrifying clarity that their 2.5 centuries of strict isolation had left them entirely defenseless against the rapidly industrializing Western world. The nation was immediately plunged into a state of profound political panic. The Tokugawa shogunate, the military government that had ruled with absolute iron authority for hundreds of years, appeared incredibly weak and completely incapable of handling this terrifying foreign threat. A fierce, bloody civil war erupted, culminating in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. The shogunate was entirely dismantled, and the emperor, who had been a powerless, ceremonial figurehead for centuries, was violently restored to the absolute center of political power. To prevent Japan from being conquered and colonized by Western powers, the new Meiji government initiated an agonizingly rapid, completely ruthless campaign of modernization. They needed a modern, conscripted national army, not an expensive, hereditary warrior class. In just a few short, devastating years, the entire social structure that had defined the samurai was aggressively dismantled. Their government rice stipends were suddenly abolished, plunging tens of thousands of proud warriors into immediate, desperate poverty. The profound, ultimate humiliation arrived in 1876 with the Haitorai Edict, a strict national law that officially banned the wearing of swords in public. The samurai were forcefully stripped of the 2 blades that housed their very souls. Many former warriors adapted, cutting off their traditional top knots, putting on Western suits, and transforming their intense discipline into successful careers in business or the newly formed imperial military. But for others, the loss of their profound identity was an unbearable, agonizing betrayal. This deep, simmering resentment finally exploded in 1877 with the Satsuma Rebellion. Led by Saigo Takamori, a man often deeply romanticized as the true last samurai, tens of thousands of disenfranchised warriors rose up in a desperate, deeply tragic final stand against the imperial government. It was a heartbreaking, incredibly bloody clash of ancient honor against cold industrial efficiency. The rebels, many fighting with traditional swords and fierce, unwavering bravery, were ultimately obliterated by the imperial army's modern artillery and Gatling guns. When Saigo Takamori committed ritual seppuku on a bloody hill after being fatally wounded, the samurai class officially and permanently died with him. Yet, while the physical warriors were entirely wiped away by the relentless march of modern history, their ancient ideals absolutely refused to fade into the shadows. The intense, unyielding spirit of Bushido did not die. It merely evolved, deeply permeating the very foundation of modern Japanese society. In the 20th century, the fierce, absolute loyalty once demanded by the daimyo was seamlessly transferred to the modern corporation. The famous Japanese salaryman, dedicating his entire exhaustive life to the success of his company in exchange for guaranteed lifetime employment, is the direct, undeniable psychological descendant of the loyal samurai retainer. That same intense discipline, the profound respect for hierarchy, and the unwavering dedication to absolute perfection in one's craft still deeply influence modern Japanese education, art, and daily social etiquette. Furthermore, their terrifying, brilliant legacy has entirely captivated global pop culture. From the sweeping cinematic masterpieces of Akira Kurosawa, which directly inspired the dusty, iconic gunslingers of American westerns, to the mystical, sword-wielding Jedi Knights of the Star Wars universe, the echo of the samurai rings loudly across the globe. We remain deeply, hopelessly fascinated by them, completely drawn to the intoxicating, romantic concept of a life lived with such absolute, unwavering conviction. They were a people forged in the most terrifying, bloody extremes of human experience, leaving behind a haunting, beautiful legacy that perfectly reminds us of the profound, incredibly dangerous power of absolute devotion. As we look back through the heavy, lingering mists of time, the true legacy of the samurai becomes remarkably clear. They were not simply the bloodthirsty killers of our wildest myths, nor were they the flawless, romanticized heroes of modern cinema. They were, above all else, deeply complex human beings, desperately trying to navigate a world defined by extreme, unpredictable violence. They attempted to impose order upon chaos through the sheer, unyielding force of their own iron will. What continues to captivate us today, what keeps our eyes glued to their rusted armor and their incredibly pristine, silent blades, is the breathtaking, impossible paradox of their existence. In a modern world that often feels dangerously devoid of profound meaning, where commitments are easily broken and loyalties shift with the wind, the samurai stand as a haunting, magnificent monument to absolute, terrifying devotion. They chose to live on the razor-thin, agonizing boundary between life and death, mastering the brutal, unforgiving art of destruction, while simultaneously cultivating a heartbreaking, deeply empathetic appreciation for the fragile beauty of the universe. They taught us that a hand capable of ending a life must also be capable of gently brushing ink to paper, and that true strength is not merely found in the ability to conquer others, but in the absolute, total conquest of one's own crippling fears. The armor may now sit empty in silent, dimly lit museums, and the great towering stone castles may slowly be reclaimed by the ancient pines, but the spirit of the warrior remains. It lingers in the quiet, focused breath before a difficult task, in the relentless pursuit of absolute perfection, and in the profound, unspoken understanding that the cherry blossom is most beautiful precisely at the very moment it falls.